Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, Episode 8. Thank you for the continuing questions that come in. You can send us your questions at any time anonymously, meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. You can also watch the previous 7 episodes when you go to that same page and you find the archived section. So to continue on in answering the questions, I want to finish some points that I did not complete in previous sessions, in previous episodes, as well as begin some new topics. But I also would like to introduce something I like to do every week. When I get feedback, it's interesting, I believe, for myself and for everyone to hear some of the feedback. So I'd like to begin with reading some feedback from about a previous episode. In episode 4, I discussed adult addiction, particularly internet. So one writer wrote that there are some additional elements that can be used that are worthwhile suggesting to the listeners. So I'd like to just read this writer's suggestions. Many addicts are not able to control their addiction. Definition of an addict: telling an addict to think Tanya, self-control, may at times be helpful, but sometimes need more intervention. Some successful strategies include stay away from temptation, move the computer to a public place where you can't be alone, unplug the computer at night and leave the wire in your wife's drawer, etc. Get accountability software. There's a great free software like X3 Watch, which sends accountability logs to a buddy of your choosing. Knowing someone will see what you do helps control the temptation. Replace one habit with another. If you feel lonely at night, try to meet that need some other way. Schedule a 20-minute date time with your wife, speak with a family member on the phone, etc. If you feel you need a physical exercise release, try some exercises. Keep an accountability calendar where you mark each night you're able to stay free, celebrate a week, a month, etc. Understanding what the triggers the habit are and trying to interrupt the process before it reaches the computer time. So I appreciate this writer's suggestions, yet at the same time, these are far more behavioral approaches, and I was discussing both getting to the root of it and trying to replace it with far more positive rewiring of a person's being, which is where Chassidus comes in. Practical suggestions are always good, but they become far more effective when you have an ability to actually reframe and actually make a new life approach to your issues. So one does not negate the other, and everything that works is usable. Again, this is Chassidus Applied, trying to use Chassidus to help us make a move, a shift in our lives, reclaim our pure souls, etc., etc. Another letter I'd like to read was connected to episode 6, where I discussed about whether a relationship, a marriage, is ever considered hopeless. And obviously I concluded that it's not. In every relationship there's always a possibility for hope. So I received a very interesting letter which I thought was quite fascinating to share. Thanks so much for your amazing lectures. This writer writes, I await your lectures every week and I can't get enough of it. I was thinking many times to get divorced. I have children, but my wife has many disabilities, including high-functioning autism, ADD, and slight depression, and was in the past highly abusive. I chose to stick it out for many years, waiting for the kids to get older and then decide on what to do. I suffered tremendously. It is beyond anyone's imagination what I have and my children have gone through. To make it very clear, I would have rather been dead than seeing my children, myself, and including my wife going through this nightmare. But here comes the most amazing part of it all. After many years of marriage, my wife is a new person. So much so that my kids are just loving it. Unlike many mothers that are so needy, my wife will do anything for them literally. She's a selfless human being. There's so much more to write, but as you made it very clear, there's no such thing as a hopeless marriage. I read this literally word for word. So there you have real life experience. This is what makes it so gratifying. So though we're dealing with some issues that are quite painful and challenging as well as sensitive, but when you receive a letter like that, as I said, it makes it all worthwhile. So moving right along, There was some knots I want to tie up that was not fully addressed in previous sessions. I'll go in order. The question that I did not answer last episode was when to educate our children about intimacy. And the questioners wrote, please specify at about what age are you speaking about when it comes to educating our children about sexuality? And rephrased, when and how to teach kids about the birds and the bees. So I looked far and long in the Rebbe's talks and the Rebbe's letters and answers. I did not find any particular reference to any age. I did mention the letter that the Rebbe wrote to Dr. Monk, which talks about the general idea of sex education, but more in schools and not necessarily even in our own homes. So I go a little on the limb here to say I cannot say 100% exactly, first of all, when, and even how explicit to speak about things. But I will say this without any question, that there's many ways to speak about this with our children. I addressed it in previous episodes, but I just want to sum it up here and also address the age question. First of all, we begin communicating with our children as soon as they're born. Actually, a pregnant mother probably is communicating with her child even before the child is born, in addition to the malach, the angel teaching the child the entire Torah in the mother's womb. So we communicate with our children from the youngest of age. Obviously, we're not going to talk to a young new child about intimacy in any explicit way, and even later not in an explicit way. But never underestimate that the sexual personality of a human being begins developing from day one, just like their intellectual personality and just like their emotional personality. So how you talk in general about things, in a modest way, in a sensitive way, even things that are not explicitly or directly intimate or sexual, is still conveying a message. How we speak about the body, how we toilet train, how we talk about things that sometimes seem inappropriate. So in general, when we talking about the birds and the bees, there's talking about it in a very specific way. There's also the general gist of just how we speak in a very tznius, and we spoke about tznius as a modest, about the dignity of a human being. That dignified message that should be both talk about dignity and speak in a dignified way has to be going on through a entire child's development. Without ever getting into necessarily, especially in earlier years, any more specific discussion. Now, when a child begins to reach an age where you start seeing that they're becoming aware of their own bodies, whether it's a girl going through puberty and there clearly a mother has to educate her daughter, and a boy going through whatever he's going through, I think it has a lot to do with when you see that child having that awareness and consciousness on their own. So why wait till they pick it up in the street or from friends or from whoever it may be? So then, in a very subtle and edele and refined way, you can begin to speak about it based on what you see, how they're reacting. And I think this really comes down to being sensitive to our own children. For some people, they're already children that at 9, 10 years old may already be somewhat being suggesting. You could see it in a joke, or you could see it in some other fashion, or a little later, or a little earlier. And obviously, this isn't about sitting down and just going through techniques and a physical description of every part of the human body and what it does. It's about an attitude, as we discussed, an attitude to who you are as a human being, who you are as one day being a father or a mother, or bearing children, building a family. And the whole idea of taras mishpacha is far more than just mikveh and just sexuality. Taras mishpacha means a sacred home, a sacred environment. And when you fill a house with holy books, and you fill a house with holy talk, when you light Shabbos candles, that it's a zgula for shalom bayis, talking to our daughters about that, talking to our sons as well. That already, you're talking about intimacy, but you're talking about it not in a direct way, and you're talking about it in a way that's about the environment. And so specifically, I would say the age should be defined by when you see children already able to, or already interested, or in some way showing consciousness and awareness. And commensurate to that stage, begin small, slight conversations. What I would definitely resist doing is sitting down a child and say, let me now sit down with you, we're going to talk about the birds and the bees. This may be a secular approach. I don't know if it's good for anybody or healthy, because it sounds immediately very foreboding and threatening and like, oh, we're going to learn a new big secret. I think it has to be done far more gentler, far more seamlessly, connected to Shabbos, connected to family, connected to children. It doesn't have to be in any explicit way. Say enough that a child will have oisius, words, to be able to work with it, to be able to process it. And it ultimately comes down case by case, both by age and how to communicate. Obviously, as a child begins to grow into adolescence, and they're going to 13, 14 years old, and they've gone beyond puberty, and they've gone into their adolescence, and there, if you've spoken about it in a non-self-conscious fashion, generally speaking, your children will see that they can talk about it perhaps a little more open than obviously, but all case by case and child by child. Okay, now, also continuing a subject that I covered to some extent, but like to continue, and that's about grudges and anger, and in general our reactions to other people when a grievance, when a wrong, when in some way we've been hurt. So we spoke about it in the context of Tanya, the end of chapter 12, where the Alter Rebbe says clearly that even when someone did something to you, and he describes all different fashions of whether it's whether they hurt you, or whether there's a grudge, or there's anger, or there's a jealousy, or anger, a kas, and so on, and also from Ageres HaKedesh Simon Chav Hei, and the general approach, learning from Yosef and his brothers, how he treated them, that even though he was entitled to have plenty of grudge against them, he saw this as an act of God. And then I said that this came from Hashem, and do not feel bad. He basically consoled them. This does not mean, as the Alter Rebbe makes it very clear, that they're not responsible for their behavior. Because as he says there, that Ala Mazik, he will be accountable for Rei B'chirasei, for the negative choice he made. But from the perspective of the person who's on the receiving end, you have to see it as Hashgacha Pratis and actually see it almost as a good, because there's nothing that God does is not for the good, and there's a good benefit in it. So of course the follow-up question, the obvious follow-up question, which I shall read, what about horrific situations? Do we also have to thank the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, for the good that God brought us through them? Even though, yes, they'll be punished for what they did. But do we have to see it in a way that we thank them? That we actually do not pay back in kind? Is there no room for anger there? Is there no room for any misgiving, any type of negative attitude? Rephrased, another questioner wrote something like this. I know you spoke about grudges, but what if it's more than just a verbal grudge? For example, someone stole $100,000 or more from you. Another example is someone who worked for you and you took them in under pity, leaves and opens the same business as you. Another example, a tenant who doesn't pay rent and gives you a hard time till he leaves you in court. And then finally, after all this misery he's put you through, he leaves. And he cuts the wires from the oven, stuffs up the shower pipe, colors on the walls, etc. Another example, someone who molested your child. How can one be nice to these type of people? Hagoyim l'chayovim tevis, the Alter Rebbe says. That you should repay them, not only not repay them in kind, but repay them with kindness. That's one thing, being neutral, move on. But he says to repay them with kindness. So it's an excellent question, because you can say the Alter Rebbe makes sense if it's something that is not extreme. But the Alter Rebbe does not make this exception. Yosef and his brothers, they almost killed him. They sold him and they kidnapped him, basically. And that's why later, as I mentioned, Asari Aruge Malchus, they were punished because of selling someone into slavery. So we're not talking about a small thing. It's equal and even more than the tenant who painted on the walls. That goes into the category like the Nazis, perhaps. Or any type of true crime that creates a serious injustice. So what does the Alter Rebbe mean? So obviously we need more explanation. So let's go a little deeper. And when you understand the profundity of the Alter Rebbe's message, you can see the depth of Chassidic psychology. And I would challenge anyone to find in other schools of psychology such a profound insight into the human condition. On a very basic level, it seems that the Alter Rebbe is saying that you should transcend your feelings. Yosef did not let it get to him. He realized there's a higher purpose. So yes, it was painful. Cut away from his father for 22 years, all that he went through. But at the end of the day, he saved the Jewish people. He saved the world from famine. So transcend, because there's always a deeper story, an inner choreography. That's what would be the seeming obvious interpretation. The same thing with anger. The immediate situation would perhaps would seem to demand a reciprocal response of anger or grudge. But kol hakayis, anyone who gets angry is like idolatry, because you have to realize it all comes from God, And it's not about you. There's a bigger plan. So though the person who did it deserves punishment, you should transcend it and realize kol the Ovid HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the tov of it, everything God does for the good. So there's an inner good, a hidden good, and you should even thank Him in a way for the good. So it seems like a transcendent definition. But there's something deeper when you think about it. What the Alter Rebbe is saying is that if you allow yourself to remain a victim mode, and how can you see that? By carrying an anger and a grudge, in a way, the victimizer, the abuser, remains in control because they're still controlling your attitude. So before they controlled it by doing something inappropriate. And now they control it by you being angry at them. So it continues to be, you're not free from those people. So this isn't about their crime at all. It's about freeing yourself from their clutches. Not allowing them to occupy the valuable real estate of your mind and your heart and your consciousness and your soul. Because every second you give them with your anger is taking away a second from your life. So they're continuing to rob you of your freedom, of your choices. So the word here is not just transcendence. Transcendence, yes. But understanding that God's deeper plan is also freeing you from that person. What's Avodah Zarah? Worshipping a false God. Worshipping a God on your terms. Worshipping something that is man-made or man himself. When you understand that God runs your life, you're not worshipping anyone. Avodei atam v'lei avodim la'avodim. You're God's servant. You're not a servant of anyone, and therefore you're not a servant of their actions. So ultimately, it's really about freeing yourself. It's not about getting them off the hook, which is why the Alter Rebbe makes it very clear. They will be punished for their bad choice, and probably in the most severe way. But that's not your business. That was their problem. Why should their problem become your problem? That's the point that the Alter Rebbe makes. And therefore, yes, no matter what situation, whether $1 million was stolen from you, or even the Nazis, you want to free yourself. I want to move on with my life. Now, the human nature is, of course, we are extremely angry. Our blood boils when we hear what the Yamach Shemam, the Germans, did to the Jewish people. Or, for that matter, a mini Holocaust. Of course our blood boils. But at the end of the day, how are you going to channel that blood boil? How are you going to channel that anger? You can channel that spending the rest of your life at hunting down Nazis and finding them and bringing them to justice. If somebody wants to make that their mission. Or you can do as many Holocaust survivors say, my revenge. They open up a photo album of their children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren. That's our revenge. So what have you done? You've taken all that passion, all that anger, and you've channeled it toward a productive end. And you don't let them continue to haunt you and not let you move on with your life. Professor Elie Wiesel, when the Rebbe persuaded him to marry and have a child, which he ultimately ended up doing, was this argument. He was saying he can't. His guilt, his feeling that he should have been dead, doesn't want to bring children into such an ugly world. And the Rebbe said the exact opposite. If you do that, the Nazis continue to control your life. There's a long letter in Yiddish in the Likutei Sichos. I believe it's the Haisofis of the edition of volume 33 or 34, where the Rebbe writes to him about this. So in other words, yes, it's very painful, and we don't forget that quickly, but we try not to allow it to occupy us, and we try allow our energy to be channeled toward building something. So speak more specifically, if someone really messed you up in business or something else like that, the temptation is to be consumed with vengeance, to get even with them. So yes, if you have a lawyer and you can sue someone and they deserve to be sued, fine if you think that's a recourse that you should do. Some people don't like to do that either. They want to move on with their lives. Recourse, fine. But then let it rest. Don't let it become your obsession. Obsession to get even with that person. Because then it's an obsession with yourself. It's an obsession with that other person and has nothing to do with real MS. It's to do with you and your feelings have been hurt or you've been in some way betrayed. Whereas if you learn to transcend that by understanding it's not about you and focusing not about the other, and you're not a victim of anybody's, you can do anything you want with your life, that is the best way to free ourselves. Which brings me to another topic regarding the issue of mechila. There's laws of forgiveness. And people think, what is the laws of what do you mean forgive? Erev Yom Kippur, someone comes to you, so there's a halachas in Shulchan Aruch, and based on the Gemara, that you should not be an achzari, you shouldn't be cruel, and you should forgive. What happens if it's an unforgivable act? Why forgive? So mechila comes from the word mochel. It means forgive, but also means mochel is a circle. When you forgive, it's not just you're forgiving and having compassion on another person, and therefore, getting them off the hook. Forgiveness is you forgiving yourself and completing the circle that was broken, that you don't continue to be haunted by that person's crime. So again, it's not necessarily about that other person. It could also be that you have that compassion and that you transcend. So there's an interesting halach. If you look in the laws of Hilchos Yom Kippur, the Alter Rebbe, in Siman Tov Reish Vav, that's 606, in volume 4 of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So he talks about this, and he says something very interesting when it comes to, he talks about, of course, the responsibilities of somebody that did something wrong. You have to go and ask for forgiveness. That's one side, which we're not really discussing right now. But then there's the responsibility of the person who's been hurt. So he says that a person should not, the one that has to forgive should not be cruel from forgiving, but he should forgive immediately. Except gives two exceptions. And I want to suggest to anyone who wants to have real psychological insight into the human condition and interpersonal relationships, this Siman Tov Reish Vav has fascinating insights into human, where we forgive, where we don't. He says two things, two conditions. Eli im kein hu miskaven leteves hamavakish mechila kidei sheyichna levave ha'orel. You have a right, when someone has hurt you, to withhold forgiveness if your intention is for the good of the one that hurt you, in order to humble his, let's call it, hard heart, his stuffed heart, his blocked heart. Very rarely do you find in the Torah that you're given the ability, the right to do that. To not forgive, to humble him. Now, why do you have that right? Because he hurt you. Obviously, we have no right to go ahead and judge other people, which we'll soon talk about, judgmentalism. But this case, if you feel it's in his tevah that not to forgive, meaning you see that he's not sincere, you see that he may need more remorse, you are entitled to do something about that. But this is not a contradiction with what the Alter Rebbe said. Why? Because again, the whole point is, we're talking here about freeing yourself. This is also freeing yourself. It's giving you the power to make that decision. So you may even you don't have to go over and thank him necessarily, but you may, in your heart, say, I am not going to be haunted by his crime, and therefore, I, in my heart, feel this was what God wanted to happen to me. Should I forgive him or not? Here's one condition where one may not forgive. A second one he gives is, if you have a chashash, which is even a doubt, a concern, that you will be hurt by forgiving that person, you can also withhold forgiveness. Which is a topic I'd like to address in future episodes about how do we address people who've hurt us in very deep ways. Forgiveness again. We're not talking now about moving on. You can move on, but then how do you deal with that person when you encounter them? And again, this is not a contradiction, because what Alter Rebbe is talking about is yourself. Your attitude should not carry a grudge and not be angry. But there's another question about forgiveness. Let's say you transcended it all. You're not letting that person affect you. But now comes the question, they're asking you to forgive. And in these two conditions, which means either to humble that person or because that person by forgiving them, you get hurt. You don't need to understand what that means. That means in some way you're still in line of fire. That person may still be destructive. That person may still be hurting you some way or another. That person, whatever the reason is, all that can also be an exception for forgiveness. But beyond that, obviously, in any given situation, a person should do everything possible to forgive. Now, the Alter Rebbe adds, the oz ein sarach limchilei, the chayav koidman l'chaya chavere. Because your life comes before another person's life. So if their life, if your life is threatened in some way, your welfare is threatened in some way by forgiving, you come first, not that person. Anyway, there's more to say about this, but let's move on to the next discussion. We also talked about judgmentalism. Judgmentalism, and I quoted from Hemshech Hayin Beis, chapter 230, approximately in those chapters, 230 and on, as well as from Maimer Kisisa Tofresh Ayin Eter. And there's more Maimorim that talk about basically self-confidence and self-esteem. Why we judge others and why we can have condescending attitudes and so on. So I discussed the issue of insecurity. Obviously, we cannot neglect to mention the Tanya as well. There's an entire chapter in Tanya that talks about this as well. Chapter 30, Perek Lamed in Tanya. And there, briefly, he says the following. There he's talking about how one should bring themselves to humility and to break the timtum halev, so to speak, the blockage of the heart. You can say some type of emotional dissonance. So in chapter 30, following chapter 29, he continues and says another eitzah, another piece of advice, which, by the way, you see continuously in Tanya, eitzah, because it's Likutei Eitz, it's collection of advice. So the Alter Rebbe brings the Mishnah, Haveshval Ruach b'fnei kol adam, that you should be lowly before all people. And he makes it very clear, he's not talking figuratively. It means emes lamite, that you actually are lower than other people, which is the best solution for judgmentalism. How could you judge someone that you're lower than? And he makes 3 key points to sum up chapter 30, which everybody can learn. 3 key points of how to maintain a sense of humility and obviously not judging others. Number 1 is, he says, Al todn chaveri al tzedaki limkeimach. Do not judge somebody until you step into his shoes, with the literal translation, until you come into his place. Because his situation could be completely different than yours. And he gives the example there of somebody whose business is constantly always in the marketplace, and therefore prone and open to all kinds of temptations. In addition, that person could also have, as he says, a passionate heart that's very heated up by all types of temptations. Since you may not be in that position, one of the two, either you spend more time at home, or you spend more time in the Beis Medrash, or you spend more time not being exposed to be seduced by different market forces, so to speak, or things that we see in the street, and you may not be as passionate, so how could you judge that person? That person has challenges that you don't have. And those challenges, so even though he says clearly, that person is responsible for his challenges too. He's not off the hook. Very similar to what we spoke about, Rei B'chirase. He has his challenge and has to deal with it. But what right do you have to judge him when his challenges are far greater than yours? So that's point number 1. Point number 2, now you have to look at yourself. How are you dealing with your challenges? If your challenges are weaker and less than his, then you have to look, are you dealing with them? And if you're not dealing with them, then how could you look at that person in any judgmental way? It's essentially reframing our whole attitude. Now, I began with the discussion of secure and insecure because at the end of the day, what causes someone to be judgmental? That the Alter Rebbe doesn't really discuss in Tanya, because that's not the focus. There he wants to simply explain how we should have an attitude to break our own so-called blocked hearts, our emotional dissonance. So that's the secure and insecure discussion. But the method that to use, lack of judgmentalism, is basically to look at another person and say, how am I judging a person like that? Do I know what they go through? And this is already a case where you know clearly that person has different challenges. But there's so many things we don't know about people. How do we know what people are going through? We can never see on the surface what a person's challenges are internally. And then finally he says, third point, how could you have a safe case? Then you could say, okay, you don't judge that, you don't feel yourself superior to that person. But what about Shval Ruach means you feel lower than that person. Why? The Alter Rebbe says something fascinating. Because you on your level should have known better. That person may not know well enough. And he brings an example for Rab Shimon, the son of, he brings in Tanya, I'll read straight from Tanya. He brings the example from Rab Shimon, who said to his father, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Lava no kasve, ele Yehuda chayte kasve. What did he say? Because he was defending himself and speaking and saying, I didn't write it, but Yehuda, the chayet, the tailor wrote it. So his father said to him, stop with your lashon hara. even though you may be justified by mentioning something negative about someone else to vindicate yourself, he brings that as an example. He should have known better. And the second example he brings from Acher, Elisha ben Avuya, who also, you should have known better because you saw God's glory, you saw what God is about. So the bottom line is that ultimately we have to see ourselves as lower than others and even humbler than others. Why? Because you know you should have known better, and that person may know less. So how could you look at that person down at that person? You are inferior in some way to that person. Now, this is not about beating yourself up. It's a way of not being judgmental and not looking down at others. I remember once at a Farbrengen, I may be the only person that ever saw this and witnessed this. It was at a Farbrengen, I don't remember exactly when. It was sometime in the early 80s, early MEMS. In the middle of Farbrengen, the Rebbe was Farbrengen Shabbos, and I stood in a position where I was pretty much across the Rebbe. And I saw that the Rebbe was suddenly, something caught his eye. So though he didn't turn his face, but I could see the eye of the Rebbe turning a little to the right. And so I also peeked a bit, and I saw there was a guy davening, a guy in a talis, since it was Shabbos. He was davening, he was sitting some, I would say, 25, 30 feet from the Rebbe toward the Aron Kodesh, so it's to the Rebbe's right. He was davening. He was davening facing toward Mizrach. So you couldn't really see his face because he was turned the other way. Then in the middle, suddenly he stood up and started davening Shemoneh Esrei, facing the Aron Kodesh. So again, his back was here. And I could see that the Rebbe was visibly disturbed. He was speaking, but his eyes kept darting there without ever moving his head. So he had to be in a perfect position to see that. The Rebbe was disturbed for obvious reasons. A guy wants to daven, middle of Farbrengen, completely oblivious of what's going on. It was like not appropriate, not respectful. And I have no doubt in my mind that the Rebbe shortened the talk, the Sikha, because within 5 minutes the Rebbe stopped speaking. They started singing a nigun. And while the Rebbe was saying L'chaim, going around, he started leaning back in his chair as to see who this is. And I could see the Rebbe was extremely disturbed by the whole scene. Anyway, finally, this guy took 3 steps back, and when the Rebbe leaned back, he could see who it was. And he saw from the person was a person who didn't know better. The person may have been by the first time by Farbrengen, didn't even know what it was. And I saw the Rebbe's demeanor and face completely change. Didn't smile, but the entire tension disappeared. Because the Rebbe realized this person didn't know better. Had it been someone that knew better, trust me, there would have been a nice chelik, a nice reprimand. So you see from this, just an example of everything is relative to the given situation. Okay, so judgmentalism is an inappropriate in every given sense of the word, for all the reasons above. You could also conclude it with a discussion about grudges and anger, about judging other people, let alone if not even having anger to them, even if they did something to you, to judge someone on what grounds? They did nothing to you, just to judge them, to be condescending, to be judgmental. And the Tanya offers us additional ways and methods to think about. If you want to think about what should cause you not to be judgmental, just think about another person's situation. Sometimes we find out about someone, what happened to them, and we are embarrassed that we even judge them. Find out what they've gone through and so on. But the point is, these are methods. We shouldn't even be judgmental, even if we find out that they didn't go through such difficult situations. Even if we find out they may even be better than us, and they should know better. It's also not entitled for judgmentalism. But that is not really the topic there in chapter 30 in Tanya. Okay. This leads me to another question, which is segue straight into another question that has been asked. It's a painful question that I've had many times, but here someone voiced it in very poignant and I guess blunt terms. I'm a Baalei Teshuva for many years. I have a PhD in mathematics and in physics, and I'm a professional. But I've always been frustrated by a number of people who see themselves as superior because they grew up, we call FFBs, from birth. And they have a condescending attitude to myself and many other Baalei Teshuva. Number one, in how they teach and speak to us, seeing us as so-called beginners, not able to fully understand things, almost like talk to us like children. And secondly, even in instruction and guidance, some mashpiyim, again treating us like children. like, basically making us, disempowering us from really solving our problems and coming to us and say, come to us whenever you have an issue. And the advice is often the advice that you give to little children. Would you mind commenting about this? And they add, don't they realize that we're grown-up adults, and some of us are professionals, and in some ways far more intellectually superior to them? So though I don't really look down at them, but when I see this type of behavior, I wonder, where is it based? What is it based on? So this is an issue that I've addressed a number of times, not in this forum. So let me address that. So firstly, based on everything we've spoken before about judgmentalism and condescension, it's very clear that this behavior is absolutely unacceptable. And I'm not going to justify it in any possible way. The most important thing to know is the following. And I always say this to anyone I teach and anyone I speak to. I've been blessed with the schuz, the merit to be giving many classes over the years, most to secular people. And many of them, when they begin their journey, I always tell them, remember this. Nobody in this world is perfect. There's some people who grew up in religious communities and may be more knowledgeable and may have been more exposed, and for them it comes like second nature, Judaism. But don't necessarily think that they're better people than you, and don't necessarily think that they're more refined. They may be, may not be. It's case by case. We're all in the same boat when it comes to personal refinement. I say this not, God forbid, to talk negatively about my colleagues, but to be realistic. Because many people have this culture shock. They come to a community of so-called frum Jews, and they say to themselves, I found the perfect community. And when the honeymoon is over, which is often pretty quickly, they realize it's not so perfect. And many are very disillusioned and very disappointed. They start seeing pettiness and all kinds of embarrassing behavior, which frankly is beneath, like I just said from Tanya, we should know better. But listen, before we repair it all, you don't want to deprive people who want to experience Yiddishkeit, want to experience Chassidus, want to experience Shabbos and koshers and all that comes with Jewish life. So we're not going to say, okay, let's fix all our issues before. So that's why it's important to sometimes qualify. And I make it very clear that I'm no tzaddik. We're in the same boat. I may have more information than you. And I think it's a vital component that was taught to us by the Rebbe, which is, we are not here as superior entities because we know more Torah and know more Chassidus and know how to read Hebrew and Yiddish and are familiar with mitzvahs because we grew up with it and by rote. That's a blessing. God has sent us a blessing. You're blessed that way to be in the right time in the right time in the right place. It should actually add to humility, because those people may be far more challenged, as I just described from chapter 30 in Tanya, because they grew up not even talking about Kal Sheba Kal, we're talking about a Tinnik Shenishba. In Tanya, he's talking about someone who is responsible. And you talk about a Tinnik Shenishba Ben Akum, which literally means a child that grew up in captivity and doesn't even know what Shabbos is. We should stand humble for such a person who had such challenges that God shows them and gave them challenges like that He never gave us. What would we be like if we had such challenges? And anyone learns even the Aleph Beis of Chassidus knows the greatest souls are given the greatest challenges. So the attitude of condescension and judgmentalism, frankly, is despicable. It comes from the same insecurities and same pettiness that anyone in the secular world has. And it's a bush and a charpa that any chassid, calling themselves a chassid, or calling themselves a Shem Torah Mitzvah, should have such an attitude. Someone that doesn't know better, that attitude is not coming from Kedusha at all. It's coming from a certain sense of pompous sense of self-aggrandizement, of thinking I'm better. For some reason, insecure people need to constantly say I'm better. It's a country club mentality of superiority that has nothing to do not with Torah and not with Chassidus. Because anyone that is a true Chassid looks at the Rebbe, how the Rebbe look at people when they went by dollars or by farbrengens. And Chassidus talks, in Ayin Beis that I quoted earlier, talks about that the true Rema Musatzmi is someone who gives everyone value and mokim. As a matter of fact, the Merem is Nimshech Achar HaShofel, and he discusses that at length. How someone who's truly esteemed, true eminence that comes from the core, actually is drawn to the shofel, the one that has the least. And different explanations given for that, because he's not filled with himself. Whereas ani v'hu, with a Baal Gaiva, someone who's pompous, filled with their own sense of value, there's no room. When the cup is full, there's no room for anyone else to enter that cup. There's no room under the canopy. Like the Tzemach Tzedek told that Jew that said, everybody's stepping on me. He says, why are you spreading yourself out over the whole shul? So whoever they step on you. So I want to make it unequivocally clear that I don't see any shemetz, even one drop of Kedusha in such condescension and judgmentalism. And now to address the issue of the communication, this idea of condescension, I don't really understand what I relate to. Basically, a good teacher has to look at a student, and based on what the student is capable of, that's what you teach. To say that someone didn't grow up with it, so I'm going to teach to them like they're two-year-old children, is ridiculous. I have learned more from people who are PhDs and doctors in all kinds of different areas because they have something to contribute, actually. Yes, they may not know how to read Hebrew quite the same way. So what? But they have other strengths, and they have other insights. And when you join it together with Chassidus, with Torah, you have a tremendous results. So that attitude of condescension and looking down at certain people and teaching them in limited ways is, to me, has no basis in any source, and definitely not in the human menschlichkeit, and Al Pi for sure not. Let alone, let's not forget the fact that every Jew taught the entire Torah in our mother's womb. So in that, we're all equal. After that, everything is downhill. So one person knows a little more, a little less. The Rebbe once told somebody who was learning Tanya, says he doesn't understand. So the Rebbe said, that's a good beginning. Because in not understanding, we're all equal. In understanding, this one knows a little more, this one knows a little less. So the idea is that every Jew has the Kol HaTeira Kula, Teira Tziva Lanu Me'Rosha Kili Sankiv. Everyone this is their birthright, their inheritance, and they were taught the entire Torah, as I mentioned from the Kutta Teira Shlach a while ago, the previous episode, that our conscious minds are made to forget, but the unconscious, it's always there. And that's why you can find people who did not grow up with it, and they can appreciate Chassidus in ways that people who grew up with it don't appreciate. Not only because Tainuk Tmid De'ena Tainuk, which means consistent pleasure is not pleasure, but because they have an insight that comes from their perspective, perhaps coming from a place where they did not have Yiddishkeit, that can appreciate the depths of the Chassidic wisdom, Chassidic Kedusha, in ways that someone who grew up with it is not able to appreciate due to the Giluyim that conceal and cover up sometimes on the core message. It's a schus and a merit to be able to meet a person who grew up in an environment that may not have been taught it and embraces it. And there's much to learn from people like that, and definitely not a position of condescension. I want to add one more thing about this. This includes people, how we mashpia, so to speak, how we mentor individuals like this. The Rebbe taught us all, empowered us, to not want to create little children who are dependent on anyone. So if the Rebbe did that to everyone around him, why wouldn't we learn from that we have to empower everybody? Why treat people like children? So I've heard the argument, because someone who didn't grow up with it doesn't have the lachluchis, doesn't have the sensitivities, the subtleties. Fine. So if you're a good mentor, you make sure that you add the subtlety if it's missing. But your goal is not to cultivate a child. Your goal is to nurture an adult and empower that person, stage by stage, that they should be able to answer questions of their own, to think on their own, to deal with shalom bayis issues on their own. I've seen many Baalei Teshuva, quote unquote, I don't like the term, because the opposite of Baalei Teshuva is a Baal Aveda. Beyond that, I don't know what other category we have. So either a Baalei Teshuva or a Baal Aveda. Tzaddikim, we know what the Tanya says about tzaddikim. Beinanim, halavai, beinanim. So, but just to use the so-called social term for it, the BT, the Baalei Teshuva is a human being, an adult. Why should they have to struggle, shalom bayis, and just have to run to a teacher every time? Empower them, just like you empower your children, empower everybody to be adults. And finally, often when we're insecure, and we have, when someone says, this is my Baalei Teshuva, so I understand the schar, the schus of that, my Baalei Teshuva, but the fact of the matter is that it's not about our feeling more powerful because we have these people, so-called, we own them. We don't own anybody. Everybody is God's child. Everybody deserves to be treated that way. And that's the ultimate dignity that we have to accord every human being, especially people who struggled and came to Yiddishkeit later in their lives for whatever reason, God's mysterious reason. And there's more to talk about that too, those mysterious reasons, which we'll reserve as well for a future episode. Let's now move over to bullying. Okay, bullying seems to be a topic that many people are writing about. For some reason lately I've seen it all over, and we've also received very many questions. Just to read a few quick ones. How about the huge issue of letting bullying carry on in our schools? This is really a huge problem, and I think you should address it as soon as possible. Another questioner writes, what is the answer to frum Jewish children bullying other Jewish children? And if they are from learned families and are exposed to such learning, why do they cause such pain to others with their bullying? This is really bothering me and many others whose children are bullied, and there is no response that deals properly. A pained mother signs. And then there's a few other questions rephrasing the same idea. I'd rather focus on the response than on all the questions. But let me just see if there's anything more I would like to add. I believe on the websites there's been discussion about it as well, so you can look up more of the questions and all the comments back and forth. Okay. So, as I said, let me focus on the response to this. So first of all, let's begin with what we should know better as Torah Jews. There is a grave isser called a noz dvarim, which means, let's establish first and foremost the problem with bullying. Even saying a negative word to another person, embarrassing someone in public, calling them a name, are grave sins. And if you want to look it up, and I believe everyone should look it up, because I believe it's my first suggestion, is that every mechanech, every educator, every teacher, every parent, and children as well, we should just learn the halachas. Sometimes awareness of the problem. Like many issues become bigger problems because we don't think it's such a big thing. We think, when you realize that this is a fundamental principle in Judaism and in Torah, and in menschlichkeit, which is all the same, that alone makes us more sensitive to it. So pick up Perek Hazov in Baba Metzia, the Mishnah in Daf Nun Ches, a famous Mishnah 58b, and study, where he basically talks about not wronging someone else in business, financially, and then says, and the same thing is in words, and speaks about insulting or embarrassing someone, speaks about humiliation, speaks about calling someone a name, a nickname, even if everyone's used to that nickname and that person as well, and talks about the grave sin. And you'd be shocked to see how grave it is. Compares it to some of the worst sins in the Torah. Some cases worse than even murder. The Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, even though parts of the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch were lost in fire, but this we have, Hilchos Einoah v'Gnevas Das, in the last volume of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Cheshem Mishpat. You can look it up. This section begins Sif Chov Zayin, chapter 20, from section 27, 28. The end of the laws of Hilchos Einoah v'Gnevas Das, the Alter Rebbe's Cheshem Mishpat. So we have from the Alter Rebbe himself, and he sums up all the details involved in the grave sin, the grave transgression of hurting somebody in general. This is in general for all people, basic menschlichkeit, especially for a frum Jew, especially for a chassid. You don't need to go learn the whole Tanya Perek Lamed Beis to know that the whole yesod of Alter Baal Shem Tov, the foundation of Chassidus, is love of another. So for us to have to sit and talk about this is again extremely embarrassing and disturbing, but better talk than not talk, and let's address this directly and bluntly. There's a story that some of you have probably heard with the Rebbe himself. I remember when it happened. It was the year Tafshin Lamed Hey, which would be the end of 1974, November 1974, I believe. It was a Tafshin Lamed Hey. And Shabbos Tes Kislev. And Yud Kislev was on a Sunday. So the story goes that we know today that there was a mother that wrote into the Rebbe that because of her child's strange appearance, I guess that's something on there, I'm not sure exactly what it was constantly being teased by friends. An unusual appearance. the Rebbe told Rabbi Chadikov to call the principal and make sure something's being done about it. When nothing happened, the Rebbe again repeated and said, do you want me, myself, to come to school to have to intervene and handle it? The story doesn't end. Later we're told that the Rebbe usually would have verbringed on Shabbos Tes Kislev, the Mittler Rebbe's Yemeledes and Yartzeit, and then Yud Kislev on Sunday. We heard later that the bar mitzvah of that boy was on that day, and the Rebbe said, Rabbi Chadikov, if he would have verbringed, it would have disturbed his bar mitzvah. Now, the Rebbe verbringed many times on people's bar mitzvahs, but here the extra sensitivity, because the child that was hurt, the Rebbe did not want to be in any way even appear that he's also contributing to it. And on Sunday was also the bar mitzvah. Shabbos was, I guess, the kiddush, and Sunday was the bar mitzvah, and the Rebbe did not verbring for the same reason. So if you need if you don't, Shulchan Aruch is not enough, and the Gemara in Bab Metzia is not enough. So you have a story from the Rebbe directly. Some people that may drive the point home. So let's start with the fact of we have to be absolutely aware of it and absolutely negate any such behavior. Let's be realistic. It's understandable. Children play with each other. They fight with each other at times. They may say something. But bullying, I'm defining at least, is sustained. We're not talking about one time there's a spat between two children or two classmates and so on. Bullying is either a persistent thing or a group ganging up on someone, and especially someone that's weak or in some way different. So it's unequivocally unacceptable from the Torah in every possible way. You don't need Chassidus for this. But with Chassidus, it's so much more emphasized because the whole point is to love every human being. We've discussed at length. What do you know what another person is going through? So let's not talk about the psychology of it. Zero tolerance is what I would advise. Why zero tolerance? Because you're training our children to be mentioned. There are people who grow up, who bullied, and then they grow into adults. They realize if they're not stopped, they feel they're rewarded for it. It's a way of bullying your way through. And many people, kol da'alim gvar is an expression. Whoever's stronger wins, survival of the fittest. Unfortunately, many people have resort to that approach. Is that approach how we want to bring up our children? And where do they learn this? They learn this when they're children. How we treat and how we behave. So the first thing is awareness of this. A second thing is the cognizance of the deep impact and damage it does. Many people are not aware of the damage it does. I know instances of people who are still haunted when they're 50, 60 years old by how they were bullied. It affects their relationships, affects their self-confidence, affects how they go to social situations. They're constantly fear to be laughed at, to be dismissed, and so on. It's reflective of a profound disrespect and stereotyping and assault on human dignity. Everything about Yiddishkeit and Chassidus teaches us about respect of human dignity. How could children gang up and feel that they can do this and not be told you are insulting another person's dignity? And when that the person who's doing the assault will one day, God forbid, be attacked, what then? So we have to have an attitude to this, just like we mechanech our children in Chumash, in Shulchan Aruch, and so on. We have to also educate them in menschlichkeit. This is menschlichkeit. And the responsibility begins at home with parents and with teachers. Since now the red light has gone up, the alarm has gone up, it's a time to become aware. Fine. We could say, I wasn't aware of the consequences, I wasn't aware how deep it is, I wasn't aware it was my children, I wasn't aware that someone else was being hurt. Well, let's get beyond that. Now we are aware. Now that we're aware, what do we do as responsible parents? So you can start blaming everybody else. It's not my child. But be honest with yourself. And what do you want? Your child to become a monster? Would you like to find that your child is able to hurt someone else's dignity? And then find out? I'll just share two quick stories. They're not so much bullying, but they show you about sensitivity. Without mentioning names, there was a little boy in yeshiva, lost his mother, unfortunately, at a young age. One day, he was misbehaving in class. The teacher, inadvertently, I assume, said to him, leave class, go home, and don't come back without a note from your mother. This little boy was terrified. He went home, didn't know what to do with himself. He was afraid to tell his father, afraid to tell his family, because he was embarrassed. He didn't want to hurt his father. The next day, he didn't want to stay home either, so he went to school trembling. He comes into school, he doesn't know whether he can go into the class. So he decides, he's hanging around the halls, the principal sees him, says, why don't you go into class? So he finds some excuse, and he realizes he can't just hang out. You know what he does? He goes into a garbage can, a big garbage can in the corner, and just put himself in the garbage can. And every few minutes he would peek out. Once he peeks out and the principal sees, the principal says, why are you in the garbage can? So the child burst out crying and told him, my teacher told me that I shouldn't come back without a note from my mother. Obviously, the principal made sure to bring that teacher to task. The teacher was extremely remorseful, but you can never know what one word you can do with a child. It was a little girl who also was in a situation where she went to school for the first time, and she was beat up by a little girl, bullied and beat up. The little girl happened to be the daughter, the bully happened to be the daughter of the teacher. So it just amplified the situation. She went home and refused to go back to school. Refused, but and adamantly, it wasn't just regular. The parents went crazy. What do you do? Something. They couldn't figure it out. It happened to be they went to Yechidus for the Rebbe that period of time, because I think the birthday of the father. And at the end of the Yechidus, the Rebbe was talking to all the children and asked the little girl, who refused to go back to school, how's school? What are you studying? She started crying. The father saw an opportunity, he says to the Rebbe, she's a Vilnish gang, she doesn't want to go to school. So the Rebbe smiled, and we don't know why. She doesn't want to go to school, and we don't know why. The Rebbe smiled and said, Mistame hat Mädel angepatcht. Probably a girl slapped her. And suddenly this little girl acknowledged that, because she felt the freedom, once the Rebbe said it, to say yes. We have to be extremely sensitive to our children, period. This is our parental obligation, educator's obligation. It breaks my heart when I read some of these letters about the bullying. It shouldn't happen. As I said, mistakes happen. A parent sees something like that. You have an aggressive child. Whatever reason it is, we'll get in a moment to more reasons. You should not tolerate it. This does not mean you have to come down with the biggest stick, unless necessary. It starts from the beginning. Nip it in the bud. And don't allow it to continue. Either by telling your child in strong terms you're hurting somebody, or engaging the school. And same thing with teachers. You see it. This is not just children playing around. You should keep your eyes open when you see especially persistent bullying by groups, by certain individuals. And it's not difficult to nip in the bud when adults engage. The problem thrives when no one is looking and no one cares, and it's just dismissed. And has to be addressed in the most direct way without any compromise. It's an assault on human dignity. An antithesis to everything that Ahavas Yisrael stands for. And it all begins, if you can do that in school, what will you do when you become an adult and you become far more complex and have more excuses and more jaded and all that? Now, as far as the causes for it, we can analyze the causes. I'm addressing the solutions. Causes are important to know as well. They're probably a combination of many different factors. It can be something going on in the home that's not completely healthy. There can be insecurity in these children that are the bulliers. It can be a need for expressing power. And often they're replicating some of aggression they see around them. So the causes are important because you want to correct it from the root. But this happens to be an issue which can be addressed also on a behavioral level. You don't have to get to every deepest cause. Above all, we do not want to allow children to feel this is how you gain control, through bullying. That's not how you have control. You get control through influencing people. Teaching children, you want to be really in control? Inspire another child. You see someone that's a little weaker, why don't you help them out? That's what we should be encouraging our children to do. Teach them that the most courageous, powerful thing that you can do is help someone that is weaker. Help someone that is defenseless. That's a lesson. And I would make a few more suggestions if I may. Reward those that defend the helpless. Actually offer rewards. Make it part of the chinuch. This doesn't have to be only sur merah, don't bully. On the contrary, let's turn this into a positive offensive campaign, which is the way of Chassidus in general, of rewarding. Make an incentive for those that help. You see a child that is less weaker in some way, doing their schoolwork or in their personalities or they're shy or whatever it is, find a way to reward those that help such children. Exercises in teaching children to see the good in others, to listen to others, to be more sensitive. This is part of chinuch too. Teach people, how do you listen to someone that has a different opinion than you? Every class should have some engaging on that level. And this is not, by the way, just derech eretz, kodma l'teira. It's also teira. It's menschlichkeit. Tara mevi l'dei kedusha. Refined behavior brings you to sanctity. This is part of Yiddishkeit too. V'ahavta recha kamecha. Ma'da olach sani, what you don't like, don't do unto others. That's the whole teira. Everything else is commentary. So you could argue, just learning this is already the whole teira. The idach perusha, and the rest is commentary. Create a contest that students should present ideas. Make students part of the solution. Make a contest that children should suggest ideas how to stop bullying. Don't just make it necessarily an adult issue. Bring it up and say, whoever comes up with 5 ideas or one great idea gets another award. We have to also bring it back to parents. When parents see something like this or hear something like this, maybe they have to find ways, again, not necessarily always the negative, maybe bring people together. They see a child that's bullying, find a way to bring them together to play together, incentives as well, and find different methods. And the bottom line is every child deserves a pure environment, home and school. Al tige b'Mashiachai. Children are called Mashiach. In the last Simchas Torah Farbrengen of Tavshinun Beis, the Rebbe spoke about, do not touch the children, even to build the Beis HaMikdash, because they're greater than building the Beis HaMikdash. They're called Mashiach. So our children are our most precious commodity, and we have to do everything possible to create pure, sacred, safe, nurturing, building confidence and self-esteem environments for them. So it's much more than just a bullying issue. It's also a general attitude to how we look at our children. Okay. There were other topics I was going to address, but as often is the case, we run out of time, but there's always next week. So thank you for listening to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 8. And please join us again next Sunday live at 8 to 9 p.m. for episode 9. Your questions, please submit to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive, where you can also see the archives of the previous sessions. And please continue to write your questions, as well as comments and feedback, and any suggestions how to improve this, how to further address issues that are plaguing and relevant to all of us. Thank you for watching.